Chris. So for this second round of conversations, I want to ask our panelists, just so we have time for audience questions, well, let me just ask, so we have a sense of how to manage the second round questions. Would you raise your hand if you have a question that you're going to want to come up with from the audience? Okay, so we do have a few. Okay, so I think maybe we'll give 4 minutes. And so I want, if I could ask all the panelists to, I'll give you a question as a prompt, but keep in mind what the other panelists have said if you want to respond to anything. And then there's a few things I just want to kind of pull out that we're kind of seeing as themes, right? I think we're seeing thematically that there's a connection, maybe a few connections between defunding schools and privatization, and there's kind of ways that they seem to fuel each other in certain ways. We've talked about that this isn't necessarily a Republican or Democrat thing, or maybe our panelists disagree, but that it doesn't break down simply, and we should be thinking about that. That we're really talking about race and class dynamics in our country when we're talking about public education and we're talking about attempts at privatization. I'd also like to hold up that the film did a good job of showing us what they've done in Union City, right? The film did a good job of saying, actually, there's models you could pursue if you really want public education. So I would love for our panelists to keep that in mind for this next round of questions. And then also, the other thing I would just raise, right, is for us to think about is we need to know who benefits from the privatization agenda, because we need to know who's pursuing it. And our ability to predict who's pursuing it will help our ability to kind of defend our public schools. And so I just want to kind of hold up those themes for our panelists to think about in their second round of questions. So Emma, I'll just start again with you. I wanted to ask, from your perspective, what are some of the policies and legislation, initiatives, things that have laid the groundwork for what's happening in Chesterfield, in Virginia? What do you see as some of the likely next steps we can anticipate in the next couple of years?
All right, so I don't want to get too far into the nitty-gritty, but there are some things that we should know about, some recently passed legislation. It includes things that would provide tax incentives to companies for providing internships and apprenticeships to middle and high school students. So this includes children who normally, according to child labor laws, would not be able to get a job, who would potentially be working unpaid for a company, and then that company would receive a tax benefit for doing that. We're looking at some stuff that would significantly lower the age at which we start career exploration. So starting with career exploration in kindergarten, as early as kindergarten, and on top of that, not just career exploration, but a heavy emphasis on technology. So having kids from kindergarten on computers, learning computer skills, at an age when really the science tells us that we need play-based learning. And so I think those are some things that we need to watch out for in terms of the direction that this would be going. I mentioned we have the Chamber of Commerce, which speaks for businesses and is kind of pushing for some of these things. There's also Go Virginia, which you may be familiar with the name Tom Farrell, CEO of Dominion Power. I feel like I never stop hearing about him these days. He's leading the initiative for the Coliseum in Richmond, or a large part of that initiative. The pipeline that many are protesting against across Virginia that is would do significant harm to low-income minority communities. And he also works with Go Virginia, which is pushing for the idea of breaking Virginia up into regions and then identifying what are the industries in those regions, and let's try to target our career and technical education for those regions. Which, if you're living in a region that has industries that have high-paying jobs, that might, be great for your kid. But if you live in a region that has a lot of manufacturing jobs, food and beverage, a lot of low-paying jobs, the career and technical education in your child's school would be kind of funneling them into that. So what you'll see on these websites, if you look at these plans, they'll talk a lot about how they're gearing your kids up for high-paying jobs. But the reality is that not everybody, Amazon doesn't need 1,000 middle managers. They don't need 1,000 CEOs. They need a lot of warehouse employees. So the incentive to the businesses is to track children, to identify as early on as possible who they think would be the CEOs and the managers, and who they think should be the warehouse employees. And I think we can all predict whose kids they're going to identify as the warehouse employees, and we know what's going to factor into that is privilege, racial privilege, class privilge, how connected your parents are. And so this is not a good thing for our kids. And I think this kind of ties into the narrative question. Because we see sometimes these companies giving donations to our public schools or doing volunteer work in our public schools. And it's often very high profile, and it's covered in this very, positive way about, T-Mobile or Dominion or any of these companies and how much good they're doing for our public schools from the goodness of their hearts. This is the charitable arm of their organization. But here's the problem. Here they talked about how a cigarette tax helped fix or try to correct some of the funding problems they had in their public schools. We have fought before for a cigarette tax in Richmond, and it is recently now a thing, but when we first fought for that cigarette tax, a lot of what we were hearing in city council was people saying, how could you ask this of Dominion, or of Altria rather, who's been such a compassionate partner, who's made these donations and done this work for our public schools, how could you do this to them? And so I think it's important for us to understand, at the end of the day, these companies are ones who are not paying their fair share in public taxes, which is what causes the underfunding in the first place. They are privatizing, corporations as a whole are prisons to use people as slave labor. They are privatizing our schools to make money for themselves and to use our schools as job training grounds. And they are not out for the best interests of your kid. And I'm not saying that as individual people, there aren't good people in these organizations, and I'm not saying that these are some evil empire who have no good to contribute. But when it comes to public education and who makes decisions about public education, it needs to be people whose sole interest is what's best for our kids. Educators are more than capable of creating high-quality CTE programs. We do want our kids to be financially literate, to know how to manage a budget. We do want our kids to have technology skills that give them a strong resume when they come out of school. But there is zero reason that we can't have educators writing and creating that curriculum as opposed to corporations. I'd like to make one last point if I have time. Yeah? Okay. Real quick.
You're out of time.
Thank you, and I was very reluctant to ask for the mic back. And I do want to actually, I want to just repeat something Emma said, because I actually feel like we need to sit with it. These corporations aren't paying their fair share in taxes in the first place. And that's why we have defunding, and then they use defunding to advance privatization, right? And it's just worth noting, Virginia has one of the lowest corporate tax rates in the country, has not been raised in 40 years. Virginia, the income tax rate is, you pay the same percentage if you make $17,000 a year than if you make $500,000 a year. So we need to think about whether that's actually sustainable with us really funding public education, and we need to start talking about, I think, progressive taxation in Virginia and get serious about taxing the wealthy. Rachel, you wanted to kind of add on to some of the stuff that Emma was saying, and I'll let you take that in whatever direction you wanted to go. One of the, and if that's, I hope that's okay, Don, and we'll come right back to you. So please take it in any way you wanted to go. One of the questions I wanted to ask you. So the film covers Union City, and one of the things it points out is that there was in New Jersey, there was what was called an Abbott District, a state Supreme Court ruling that ruled that kids in poor districts had to have the exact same amount spent on them as kids in richer districts. And I wonder if that's something you see as a potential strategy we could use in Virginia. But yeah, please take it away.
So just to answer that question very quickly, absolutely. And I know that the Education Law Center is currently in talks or involved with trying to, they've published a few op-eds to try to get momentum to have a similar lawsuit in Virginia. Since we're in Chesterfield and the topic is CT, I did want to add on a little bit to what Emma said. There have always been public-private partnerships. Oh, I'm sorry, did I miss?
We're in Richmond.
Okay, sorry. I mean, the topic was about Chesterfield. Sorry. So there's always been public-private partnerships, and but it used to be that we educated students in CTE, and then they went out and got training with specific industries or corporations. And now that's kind of flipped, and corporations are asking schools to, the taxpayers to fund their training programs in our schools. And the same thing I think is happening with technology, where it used to be like, okay, you just get trained generally or taught generally with the technology. Now it's very brand-based. You're going to use, and there's very lucrative contracts that go with that. And that really mirrors also in the policy world. It used to be that foundations just gave grants to schools or school districts and said, okay, here's a grant to buy books, or here's a grant for field trips. And now they're saying, here's a grant for this very specific program or reform or initiative that I want you to do, or even, here's a grant to buy, here's a grant from the Gates Foundation to buy, and I don't know that this happened, it's just an example, Microsoft software for your schools. And they're doing this, the foundations are spending a lot more on pet policies. And the other angle of CTE, again, since that's kind of the topic today, there was a trend in the education reform movement that said all kids are going to go to college. And that's just not for everybody. There's something called Profile of a Graduate, which is kind of the new course of studies or kind of program for high school students. And through an externship I was a part of when I was getting my PhD, I sat in on a lot of planning meetings for that. And really the idea was like, let's bring CTE back in and let's acknowledge and elevate that type of learning and that type of skill and that type of talent. And there's nothing wrong with that. But if the industry and corporations are controlling it versus the educators, that's a problem. And the other thing is, from the research perspective, there is research recently showing that we're retracting, the intent was to detrack, right? To say like, this isn't advanced. You can be CTE and still be advanced. But the research is showing that actually within CTE, students are being kind of retracked into a higher upper level, and that's higher upper level kind of courses and job opportunities versus lower level. And it's really playing out so that's more going towards more privileged, whiter, and less privileged, more students of color. So what Emma was describing is actually playing out. The research is showing that it's playing out.
Awesome, thank you, Rachel. Or not, anyway. So Don, I want to come back to you, and the first question I asked you was about kind of what narratives are being used to, in some ways, try to overcome the facts. And you started to talk about the narratives that we need to use if we're going to be successful in defending public education. I guess I wanted to ask that maybe in a more specific way. And again, please feel free to respond to anything that's been raised. One of the things that I think is that the way we're going to be successful in defending public education, but also transforming public education into something that's really serving the needs of everybody, is if we are successful in uniting parents, students, and teachers as a part of this movement. And that's going to mean also uniting parents across racial differences, Black parents, white parents, Latino parents, Asian parents. And so I wonder if you could talk about how do we do that? As a movement, how do we do that? What are the narratives we need to do that? What are the practices we need to do that? How do we build this movement of parents, students, and teachers coming together across color lines and fighting for high quality public education?
Of course, I don't know about this from the inside because I don't work in Richmond Public Schools. But it seems to me that Superintendent Cameras has started some great conversations about integrating the only two majority white elementary schools in the school system, and instead of closing one and putting everybody in the other, let's put everybody in one of those schools for the first 3 years of elementary school and in the other for the second 3 years, and integrating those populations. I mean, there's one of our current senators said, why are we going to disrupt a school that has really good test scores? Well, let me tell you what, folks, those SOL tests were designed for Mary Munford students. They were made for them to do. Who do you think writes those tests? The type of people who might once have been Mary Munford students, who might very well be parents. So thinking out of the box and coming up with a new way to stop the resegregation of our schools, or to force integration of our schools, is going to have to happen. We're not going to solve the problem any other way. And the funding in Virginia has to change. You know, the state per pupil funding for Chesterfield is higher than the state per pupil funding for Richmond. In whose universe does that make sense? Not in mine. And I did want to piggyback on something Emma said. She talked about having kids learn how to work on computers when the really appropriate thing for the younger grades is play-based learning. You know, people talk all the time about Finland, how good they are. Well, in Finland, every hour is spent about 45 minutes in the classroom and 15 minutes out on the playground in recess. Because in Finland, they believe that recess is learning, that's how kids learn about biology. They learn about trees and leaves and grass and bugs, and they learn about falling down and getting back up and running fast and going slow, which is physics. And they're learning all of these things while playing. Here in Virginia, our education advocates had to lobby the General Assembly to pass a law to allow our elementary schools to actually include recess as part of the learning of the school day. This is crazy, and it must change.
Awesome. And so Chris, one of the things, Chris, that you were a part of was this really incredible effort called Virginia Educators United. And what we saw was one of the largest protests that we've seen demanding more public education funding at our state capitol. Potentially, we're in a position where this upcoming state legislature might be, for the first time in 25 years, filled by a majority of people who are more favorable to public education, perhaps. And I want to ask, for those of us in this room who want to follow what's happening at the level of the state legislature, who want to know where we are successfully beating things back, where we are gaining traction. What are the priorities you think we should set? What are the things that you think we should watch? What should we do to make sure that our state legislature is doing everything it possibly can to secure high quality public education?
Thanks, Gary. I think the first thing is be prepared for a lot of excuses. We've just gone through 10 years of economic recovery and economic growth, and we're still down 8% per student from where we were in 2009. And right now, if you're listening to our Secretary of Finance or to the conversations that are being had, it's an upcoming recession, and now is not the time for bold investments in new services. And And so I think being prepared that, regardless of the political landscape, it's going to be a fight to see significant changes in school funding. And another thing I would note is I don't know if people are getting their checks recently, their $110 or $220 checks. So as part of, shortly after the very successful march and rally that happened with teachers, educators and advocates during this last legislative session, there were some wonderful victories that came out of that, including a 5% pay increase for teachers and support staff. But it did not see kind of a monumental shift in how the state funds public education. And just days after that march and rally, they put forward a tax package that included $1 billion in tax cuts. That includes what cost the state $440 million is to mail people that pay income tax a check of either $110 or if they're filing jointly $220. And while that is nice to be able to get some money going to the hands of Virginians, that comes at a cost of $440 million that could have gone to public education. And I don't know if that is being expressed as widely. We're hearing a lot of people patting each other on the backs for what a great tax deal this was. And then in addition to that, that's only people that are paying state income taxes. So that means the lowest income individuals are not getting that check. So that seems pretty backward to me as well. But going forward, I think that there is a growing movement that's happening, a growing awareness that it's happening, that we can't just be looking to City Hall to fix all our problems, that it's really going to have to happen in the State House. And as we expand that awareness, going from community to community across the Commonwealth, I think then legislators will start taking the message seriously. But I wouldn't expect them to until that movement is really undergoing, because it's going to cost a lot of money. And there's, you mentioned the income tax rates, which hasn't been changed since 1984. There's a real hesitancy to talk about taxes among state leaders. And so I think it will take a groundswell of voices to really move the needle.
Thank you so much, Chris. Okay, at this time, I want to, we're running a little bit behind